Some men build fortunes. Others win the hearts of the most desired women on earth. Aristotle Onassis did both, and still ended up losing the one thing money could never buy back. He commanded the biggest privately owned fleet on the planet, married a former first lady, and turned the desperation of a penniless refugee into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Yet he spent his last years shattered by a loss that no amount of wealth could undo. This is the story of the man the whole world envied, and how he learned, too late, that fortune cannot shield you from tragedy. The fire that started it all. September 1922. A 16-year-old boy named Aristotle Onassis stood on the deck of a ship, watching the only home he'd ever known go up in flames. Smyrna, his birthplace, was a thriving, multicultural port city where he had grown up fluent in 4 languages, educated in some of the finest schools around. Now it was burning to the ground as Turkish troops swept back in and reclaimed it from Greek forces. The Great Fire of Smyrna wasn't only destroying buildings. It was wiping out everything the Onassis family owned: their properties, their business, their entire way of life. Aristotle had been born on January 20, 1906, in Smyrna's Karatas district, into a household of real comfort. His father, Socrates Onassis, ran a profitable tobacco trading business and owned a small fleet of merchant vessels. The Onassis name carried weight among Smyrna's well-off Greek community, and young Aristotle attended an elite Greek evangelical school. By 16, he already spoke Greek, Turkish, Spanish, and English, a boy set up for a golden future. Then history stepped in and ripped it away. After the First World War, Smyrna had come under Greek administration. But the Greco-Turkish conflict that raged from 1919 to 1922 upended that arrangement completely. When Turkish troops retook the city in September of 1922, they burned it. The destruction was catastrophic for the Greek residents who called Smyrna home. 3 of Aristotle's uncles, along with an aunt, her husband, and their daughter, perished when a church in Ayvalık, sheltering some 500 Christians fleeing the flames, was engulfed by fire. The disaster, remembered today as the Asia Minor catastrophe, turned the once prosperous Onassis family into refugees overnight, carrying only what they could grab on the way out. The surviving family fled to Athens, joining the hundreds of thousands of other Greek refugees pouring out of Asia Minor. They had escaped with their lives, but almost nothing else. Property, connections, security, all of it dissolved into smoke and chaos. For a teenage Aristotle, watching his entire world collapse in a matter of days, the lesson burned itself into him for life. Nothing lasts, nothing is guaranteed, and the only person you can truly count on is yourself. But there was a strange gift buried inside that loss. Having nothing left to lose meant Aristotle was free, free of fear, free of caution. Combine that freedom with the gnawing hunger of a refugee who had already tasted wealth and now refused to accept poverty, and you get a young man driven to rebuild, not just what his family had lost, but something far bigger than his father ever dreamed of. Within a year, Socrates Onassis, reluctantly at first, gave his blessing for his 16-year-old son to leave Greece behind and start over in Argentina. On August 21, 1923, Aristotle stepped off a boat in Buenos Aires carrying $250 and a Nansen passport, the special document issued to people with no country of their own. He had no contacts, no safety net, no plan B, only ambition, and the hard-won knowledge that he had already lived through the worst life could throw at him. Buenos Aires and the making of a tycoon. Buenos Aires in 1923 offered no favors to a broke Greek teenager. Aristotle took whatever jobs he could get, working as a laborer and washing dishes before finally landing a position at the British-owned United River Plate Telephone Company as a night-shift switchboard operator. The pay was terrible, but the job handed him something worth far more than a salary: access to information. Because his shifts were at night, his days were completely free, and he used that time to help rebuild his family's tobacco trade. His father and uncle had already set up a tobacco export operation back in Piraeus and were shipping Turkish tobacco to Argentina, but they needed buyers, and no Argentine cigarette manufacturer wanted to sit down with a teenage immigrant. That's where the switchboard job became his secret advantage. Working the phones at night, Aristotle listened in on business conversations. He picked up on deals in progress, contracts being hammered out, opportunities nobody else knew were coming. He used every scrap of that insider knowledge to quietly build his own deals, playing the serious businessman by day while still manning the switchboard in his work uniform at night. His real breakthrough came in the mid-1920s, when he overheard talk of an upcoming talkie film in which the lead character would be shown smoking. Aristotle instantly saw the opportunity. If cinema was about to make smoking look glamorous, cigarette demand was going to explode. What he needed was a brand aspirational enough for women to want. He tracked down Juan Gaona, the owner of Argentina's leading cigarette company, and pestered him for days until Gaona finally granted him a meeting. The gamble paid off. Gaona placed an order worth $10,000 for Turkish tobacco straight from the Onassis family's business. Then Aristotle went a step further and launched his own cigarette brand, aimed squarely at women, whose smoking habits were shifting fast as the feminist movement gained ground between the wars. As the face of the brand, he convinced celebrated opera star Claudia Muzio to be seen smoking his cigarettes in public. The strategy worked brilliantly. By the age of 25, Aristotle Onassis was already a millionaire, pulling in more than $100,000 a year from tobacco commissions alone. His home government took notice of his business talent, appointing him Greek consul general and tasking him with negotiating a trade deal with Argentina in 1928. He picked up Argentine citizenship the following year, in 1929. But tobacco wasn't going to be the ceiling for Aristotle's ambitions. In 1932, the same year his father passed away, he noticed something that would reshape his entire future. The shipowners hauling his tobacco overseas were pocketing more profit than the cigarette makers themselves. 1932 sat at the bottom of the Great Depression, the single worst possible moment to break into shipping, which meant, to a man like Aristotle, it was exactly the right time. While every other shipping firm was retreating, Aristotle snapped up 6 cargo vessels for less than half their usual price. People thought he'd lost his mind. Global trade had collapsed. The world economy was in ruins. Who buys ships when nobody's shipping anything? But Aristotle understood something his critics didn't: depression's end. Once the economy bounced back, shipping demand would surge and prices would follow. By buying low while everyone else sold in a panic, he'd set himself up to dominate the market the moment things turned around. It was a bet that would have wiped out most men. For Onassis, it became the cornerstone of an empire. World War II and the rise of the supertanker. In 1938, Aristotle ordered his first oil tanker. By the outbreak of the Second World War, he owned 3. Then came another move, brilliant from a business standpoint, ethically far murkier. He registered his entire fleet under the Panamanian flag, securing tax-free status and slashing his operating costs dramatically. That single decision made him one of the cheapest shipping operators anywhere in the world. Throughout the war, he chartered his tankers and cargo ships to the Allied forces. It proved enormously lucrative. The Allies were desperate for shipping capacity, and Aristotle sweetened his rates in exchange for favorable terms and protection for his vessels. While rival fleets were being torpedoed by German U-boats, his kept growing. Once peace returned, Aristotle bought up 23 surplus American Liberty ships at bargain prices. And then he made the move that would cement his name in shipping history. His reasoning was simple: if you want to move oil cheaply, you need bigger vessels, much bigger. In a single year, 1954, he ordered the construction of 17 supertankers. These weren't just large ships, they represented a genuine leap in scale, able to haul enormous volumes of crude far more efficiently than anything that came before. The math behind them was almost unbelievable. A single 6-month charter could pay off an entire supertanker, leaving the remaining 20 years of its working life as nearly pure profit. During the Suez crises of 1956 and 1967, when the canal shut down entirely, Aristotle's supertankers cashed in massively, hauling Middle Eastern crude the long way around, via the Cape of Good Hope. While competitors buckled under the longer, costlier route, his supertankers made the extra distance worthwhile. By the early 1950s, Aristotle Onassis controlled a fleet larger than the navies of most nations on Earth. He was one of just 2 men alive who personally owned an airline, the other being Howard Hughes with TW. His carrier, Olympic Airways, purchased in 1957, became famous for its golden age of luxury, gold-plated cutlery, candlelit first-class cabins, and state-of-the-art Comet 4B jets bought in 1959. He went head-to-head with Prince Rainier III for financial control of Monaco through his stake in the Société Bains de Mer, which owned the Monte Carlo casino and its surrounding real estate. He purchased the Greek island of Scorpios for 3.5 million drachmas and turned it into his own private kingdom. His yacht, the Christina, named for his daughter, became one of the most talked-about vessels in the world, doubling as his permanent home and a floating gathering point for global royalty and celebrity. But none of that wealth, none of that power, and none of that success could brace him for what was coming. Because while he was busy building an empire, he was also raising a family, one that would deliver both his greatest happiness and his most unbearable heartbreak. Family and the first marriage. On December 28, 1946, 40-year-old Aristotle Onassis married 17-year-old Athina, Tina Livanos. Tina was the daughter of Stavros Livanos, a shipping magnate in his own right, making the union both a romance and a strategic merger of two powerful Greek shipping dynasties. For Aristotle, joining the Livanos family wasn't just about love. It was a deliberate strike against his father-in-law and the old-money Greek elite who had always looked down on him, dismissing him as an upstart refugee, sharp but common, lacking proper pedigree. By marrying Tina Livanos, he forced that same aristocracy to finally accept him as one of their own. The couple welcomed two children, both born in New York. Alexander arrived on April 30, 1948, the very same day his father launched an 18,000-ton tanker, the largest ever built in the United States at that time. 5 years later, a young Alexander himself smashed a champagne bottle to launch a 45,000-ton tanker in Germany, the Tina Onassis, named for his mother. Christina was born on December 11, 1950. For a while, the family projected the picture of perfect wealth and happiness. The children present at grand launch ceremonies, shuttled between glittering properties, wanting for nothing money could purchase. But beneath that polished surface, the cracks had already begun to spread. By the mid-1950s, Aristotle and Tina were effectively living apart. According to Onassis biographer Peter Evans, the marriage's breaking point came when Tina discovered her husband in bed with a close friend at their home in Cap d'Antibes, the Château de la Croix. That betrayal finished off whatever was left of their marriage. But Aristotle's infidelity wasn't a fleeting fling. He had already met the woman who would consume him for the rest of his life, one whose hold on him would never fully break. Her name was Maria Callas, and she was, without question, the most celebrated opera singer alive. Maria Callas, The Great Love Story. Summer of 1957, Venice. At a party thrown by the famed gossip writer Elsa Maxwell, Aristotle Onassis and Maria Callas met for the first time. He later told a friend there had been an instant curiosity between them. After all, they were the two most famous Greeks on earth. Maria Callas, born in New York in December 1923 to Greek immigrant parents, had risen to become opera's greatest living soprano. Her voice, her dramatic stage presence, every part of her performance was already legendary. She had reinvented what opera could be, bringing raw emotional force and theatrical power that audiences had simply never witnessed before. Critics adored her, audiences worshipped her, and the entire opera world considered her utterly irreplaceable. At the time they met, Callas was married to Giovanni Battista Meneghini, an Italian industrialist 30 years her senior who also managed her career. That marriage had granted her Italian citizenship back in 1949 and given her the stability she needed to build her career in Italy during her peak years. Meneghini controlled her schedule, her finances, much of her life, but he had also stood by her when she needed support the most. Aristotle, meanwhile, was still technically married to Tina, though their union had become little more than a public performance kept up for appearances and the children. The pull between Aristotle and Maria was immediate, yet it would take 2 more years before it finally burst into the open. In 1959, Aristotle invited Callas and her husband aboard the Christina for a 3-week Mediterranean cruise. Other guests included former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his wife, though Callas later admitted she found Churchill rather dull company. It was meant to be an elegant social gathering among the elite, a curated showcase of culture and money. Instead, it became the starting point of the decade's most public, most volatile love affair. From the outset, the romance was messy. Callis initially found Onassis too forward and not especially attractive, but his relentless pursuit gradually wore down her defenses. He chased her with total focus, deploying every ounce of charm and every bit of the yacht's romantic atmosphere to break through her resistance. For Aristotle, Callis represented something he had never actually had, someone whose fame rivaled his own, someone who understood what it felt like to stand at the very top, someone whose Greek roots mirrored his own identity in a way no one else could. For Maria, Aristotle offered an escape hatch from a career that had grown increasingly punishing. She was battling vocal strain and neurological trouble that made performing physically painful. Scandals over her reputedly difficult temperament, plus a rumored rivalry with fellow soprano Renata Tebaldi, had worn her down. The non-stop pressure of being crowned opera's reigning diva was exhausting her completely. Aristotle offered her a way out, a chance, finally, to live as a woman rather than exist purely as a voice in service of art. By the time that 1959 cruise ended, it was obvious to everyone aboard, the crew, the other guests, all of them, that Aristotle and Maria had fallen head over heels for each other. Their constant time together had lit a fire neither of them could hide anymore. Tina Livanos, who had enjoyed Callis's company at the start of the voyage, grew increasingly suspicious as the cruise wore on. By the end, she left the ship early, unable to stomach watching her husband's affair unfold right in front of her. The press erupted. Gossip columns had already been linking the pair before the cruise even began. By the time it ended, both the Onassis and Meneghini marriages were clearly finished. In November 1959, Callis walked away from her husband, ending a 10-year marriage. Publicly, she claimed her split was driven by an ambition to break into film, not by her romance with Onassis. Nobody bought it. Tina filed for divorce in New York's Supreme Court in 1960 on grounds of adultery, the only legal basis for divorce in the state at the time, and sought custody of Alexander and Christina. The divorce was finalized in June 1960, right in the middle of Aristotle's very public affair with Callis. What followed was 9 years of a relationship that swung wildly between bliss and open warfare. Once both had finalized their divorces, they alternated between adoring one another and tearing each other apart. Friends described their bond as one that thrived on shouting matches and physical scuffles just as much as passion. The volatility was extreme, the emotional highs and lows, exhausting. Maria wanted to leave the stage behind, settle down, and start a family with Aristotle. She fell pregnant in 1960 but lost the baby. According to some biographers, including Nicholas Gage, the child was a boy who died only hours after being born, on March 30, 1960. The loss devastated her, and Aristotle was away when it happened, deepening her grief. She conceived again in 1963 and lost that pregnancy too, once more while Aristotle was absent, this time because he was busy hosting Jacqueline Kennedy and her sister Lee Radziwill aboard the Christina. The timing could not have been crueler. Some accounts suggest she became pregnant a third time in 1966 but ended the pregnancy at Aristotle's insistence, though this was never confirmed publicly. The relationship was, in many ways, deeply unhealthy, a fact that became harder to ignore as the years dragged on. Despite her talent and worldwide fame, Callis struggled with low self-worth in her personal relationships. She had been raised by a domineering mother who pushed her relentlessly toward success. Her marriage to Meneghini had likewise been controlling. Now, with Aristotle, she found herself yet again in a relationship where the power sat almost entirely on the other side. Aristotle held the reins, controlling her emotionally while refusing to marry her even after both of them were free to do so. He was drawn to her fame. It gave him status, validation, the pleasure of being seen beside the world's greatest soprano. But he wasn't willing to make the commitment she desperately wanted. So why wouldn't he marry her? The reasons were tangled. Partly he enjoyed the freedom their arrangement gave him. Partly he still had ambitions that called for different alliances. And partly, having watched his entire world burn down as a boy, he had developed a deep-seated fear of permanence. Everything could vanish in an instant. Everything could burn. So why tie yourself down? Callis often said Aristotle was the first person who truly accepted her, flaws and all. She played a nurturing, almost maternal role in his life, something he had never experienced from anyone else. His own mother had died when he was young, cutting that bond short early. Tina had never offered him that kind of care. Maria did, creating a bond that was part romance, part maternal comfort, entirely consuming. And yet his treatment of her was often cruel, sometimes deliberately so. At President Kennedy's birthday celebration at Madison Square Garden in 1962, Maria attended and even performed, but history remembers that night only for Marilyn Monroe's breathy rendition of Happy Birthday in her glittering, skin-tight gown. Aristotle brought Maria that night, then later told her that nobody cared about Monroe's singing voice, just as nobody cared about Callis's body. The remark was brutal, reducing her artistry to nothing while elevating Monroe's sex appeal above everything Maria had built. Maria essentially gave up her career for him. Her voice deteriorated, her performances grew scarce, and her entire focus narrowed to their relationship. When director Franco Zeffirelli asked her in 1963 why she'd stopped practicing her singing, she told him she'd been busy trying to live her life as a woman. The same Maria Callas who had commanded opera houses across the globe and redefined the art form had put it all aside for a man who refused to marry her. Through 1960, the two were seen together constantly, no longer bothering to hide the relationship. Photographers snapped them holding hands, dining out, behaving as an open couple. While they were together, Aristotle bought the island of Scorpios, building a private retreat where they could escape public life. For a while, it looked as though the relationship might finally settle into the marriage Maria wanted. But Aristotle kept holding back. Years slipped by. Maria kept waiting. And then, in 1963, everything shifted. Aboard the Christina, Aristotle hosted a gathering that included Princess Lee Radziwill and her sister, Jacqueline Kennedy. Rumors swirled that Lee was involved with Aristotle, and Maria noticed how much attention he was paying to both sisters. By this point, she had come to terms with his repeated infidelities, accepting that his need for conquest went beyond just her. After President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, Jacqueline sank into deep mourning. Just months earlier, in August, she had lost her newborn son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. Now she had lost her husband to an assassin's bullet. Lee Radziwill, sensitive to her sister's pain, and perhaps eager to strengthen her own bond with Aristotle, invited Jackie aboard the Christina to recover. By the end of that voyage, everything had changed. Aristotle gave Jackie a diamond necklace. He gave Lee a bracelet so unimpressive she later joked that not even a 6-year-old would want to wear it. The message was unmistakable. Aristotle had made his choice, though it would take another 5 years before he acted on it. 5 more years of continuing his relationship with Maria, 5 more years of promises that never quite turned into a proposal, all while quietly courting Jackie Kennedy behind the scenes. Maria watched it all happen, powerless to stop any of it, still clinging to the hope that Aristotle would eventually pick her. After all, they were both Greek. They understood one another in a way she believed transcended wealth and celebrity. Surely that meant something. Surely he'd realize what they truly had together. She was wrong. When Aristotle finally announced, in 1968, that he intended to marry Jacqueline Kennedy, the news very nearly destroyed Maria Callas. The marriage to Jackie Kennedy. October 20, 1968, on Scorpios, Aristotle Onassis's private Greek island. There, the billionaire married Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, widow of America's 35th president. The wedding stunned the world and left Maria Callas in pieces. Before the ceremony, Aristotle and Ted Kennedy, Jackie's former brother-in-law, negotiated a settlement. Jackie would receive $3 million, plus $1 million each for her children Caroline and John Jr., compensating for the annual $150,000 she'd forfeit from the Kennedy family trust by remarrying. After Aristotle's death, she would continue receiving $150,000 every year for the rest of her life. On paper, the marriage made perfect sense. Aristotle had a habit of collecting famous, beautiful women, and Jackie Kennedy was arguably the most famous woman alive. Marrying her lifted his profile to heights even his shipping empire couldn't reach on its own. For Jackie, Aristotle offered security, privacy, and an escape from the relentless media attention she faced in America, protection for her children, and the freedom to finally live on her own terms. But the marriage struggled from day one. During a rocky stretch together in Acapulco, things soured so badly that Aristotle handwrote a new will aboard a private plane, stating that if Jackie ever contested it, she'd receive only the bare legal minimum required under Greek inheritance law, 12.5%, along with all associated legal costs. The couple technically shared 6 homes: Jackie's 15-room apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York, her horse farm in New Jersey, Aristotle's residence on Avenue Foch in Paris, his house in Athens, his estate on Scorpios, and the Christina itself. Despite all that space and wealth, they spent less and less time actually together, and Maria Callas never truly disappeared from the picture. According to Aristotle's private secretary and other close insiders, even during his marriage to Jackie, he continued meeting Maria in Paris. Their affair quietly resumed, picking up right where it had left off. He reportedly told Maria he'd finally realized she was the one true love of his life, but by then, the damage was already done, and it was far too late to fix what he'd broken. Many within Aristotle's Greek social circles saw the marriage to Jackie as an act of arrogance the gods would eventually punish. And punish him they did, with a cruelty severe enough to break a man who had already survived the burning of Smyrna, war, poverty, and every business obstacle imaginable. The death of Alexander. January 22, 1973, Athens. 24-year-old Alexander Onassis arrived at Ellinikon International Airport for what was supposed to be a routine training flight. As president of Olympic Aviation, a subsidiary under his father's airline, Alexander was supervising flight instruction for a potential new pilot, Donald McCusker. Alexander had earned his pilot's license back in 1967 and had logged around 1,500 hours in the air. Poor eyesight ruled out an airline transport license, but he could hold a commercial pilot certificate, letting him fly light aircraft and emergency medical transport. Flying was one of the very few parts of his life that belonged entirely to him, untouched by his father's overpowering influence. His relationship with Aristotle had never been simple. He and his sister Christina were devastated by their parents' 1960 divorce, and then horrified all over again when their father married Jacqueline Kennedy in 1968. Alexander reportedly said his father had married Jackie for her name, and Jackie had married his father for the money. The bitterness between them ran deep. To make things worse, Alexander was quietly involved with Fiona Campbell Walter, the former wife of Baron Hans Heinrich Thyssen-Bornemisza. She was 16 years his senior, beautiful, wealthy, and fiercely independent. Aristotle strongly disapproved. In the year leading up to his death, Alexander had repeated clashes with his father, both over business decisions at Olympic and over his relationship with Fiona. He'd told his father he planned to leave the company and marry Fiona, determined to break free of his father's overwhelming control. On that January afternoon, Alexander boarded his personal amphibious aircraft alongside McCusker and his regular pilot, Donald McGregor, who was covering the flight while recovering from an eye infection. The plan was to practice amphibious landings near the islands of Aegina and Poros. Just seconds after lifting off, the plane's right wing dipped and refused to come back up. It crashed in a flight that lasted barely 15 seconds. All 3 men suffered serious injuries. Alexander was first rushed to a nearby American military hospital, then transferred to KAT Hospital in Athens. Aristotle was in New York when he got the news. Witnesses said he collapsed on the spot before rushing straight to the airport. The next day, January 23, he landed in Athens with Jackie and went directly to the hospital. Alexander's mother, Tina, flew in from Switzerland with her new husband, Stavros Niarchos, Aristotle's fiercest business rival, who had married Tina after her split from Aristotle. Aristotle flew in British neurosurgeon Alan Richardson from London, but Richardson delivered news he never wanted to hear. Alexander had suffered catastrophic brain and skull injuries with no chance of recovery. At 7 p.m. on January 23, 1973, 27 hours after the crash, Alexander Onassis died. The forensic finding was severe brain hemorrhage from the crash injuries. Remarkably, the two American pilots who had been with him walked away with only minor injuries. That discrepancy tormented Aristotle. He simply couldn't accept it as an accident. A skilled pilot with 1,500 hours of experience dying in a 15-second flight, while the other two survive. Impossible, he decided. It had to be sabotage. It had to be murder. Aristotle briefly considered having his son's body cryogenically preserved, but was talked out of it. Instead, Alexander was embalmed and laid to rest beside the chapel on Scorpios, the same private island that had once been the setting for so much of the family's happiness, now holding the body of Aristotle's only son. Within a month of Alexander's death, manslaughter proceedings began against McCusker. By January 1974, 6 people had been formally charged in connection with the crash, with investigators pointing to faulty flight controls fitted to the aircraft. Aristotle blamed everyone he could think of: the CIA, the leader of the Greek military junta, Georgios Papadopoulos, Stavros Niarchos, even employees of Olympic Airways itself. In December 1974, he took out a public advertisement offering a $1 million reward for proof that Alexander's death had been deliberate rather than accidental. The official investigation had already concluded it was an accident caused by faulty maintenance controls. Aristotle refused to accept it. He couldn't accept it. Believing his son's death was a random, meaningless mechanical failure would mean it was pointless, senseless, a waste beyond repair. Nobody ever collected the reward. Every charge was eventually dropped. In 1978, 3 years after Aristotle's own death, McCusker was awarded $800,000 by Olympic Airways. The official cause was ultimately recorded as reversed aileron cables, wired incorrectly during a maintenance overhaul on the control column. But for Aristotle Onassis, the facts didn't matter anymore. His son was gone. His heir was gone. The young man he had groomed to carry the Onassis name forward now lay buried on a Greek island at 24 years old, never to grow any older. The final years. Aristotle never got over it. He had survived wars, cutthroat business rivals, the destruction of his childhood home, and years of poverty and exile. But he could not survive the death of his son. It was the collapse that finally broke him. After Alexander's death, Aristotle seemed to age decades overnight. Friends and colleagues watched the once vibrant, restless man turn into a shadow of himself. He had always been superstitious, and now that superstition swallowed him whole. He became convinced Jackie had brought a curse down on the family. Both John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. Now his son was dead too. To him, the pattern was undeniable. His relationship with Jackie fell apart completely. She spent less and less time with him, preferring her life in New York over a grief-stricken husband who quietly blamed her for his son's death. The marriage that had once shocked the world had become an empty shell, 2 people bound by paperwork neither of them wanted anymore. His daughter Christina made no secret of her contempt for Jackie, and she echoed her father's belief that Jackie had cursed the family. The household grew toxic, thick with suspicion, grief, and resentment. Aristotle's health began collapsing too. He'd struggled with respiratory issues for years, but now they worsened dramatically. His business empire, once his greatest source of pride, stopped meaning anything to him. What was the point of building an empire with no son left to inherit it? What was the point of any of it, really? Maria Callas, the woman he had abandoned for Jackie Kennedy, became his comfort once again. The two reconnected in Paris, spending time together in a way they hadn't in years. Aristotle reportedly admitted to her that she had always been the real love of his life. But that realization came far too late. The damage was permanent, and his time was running out. In early 1975, Aristotle's condition took a sharp turn for the worse. He was admitted to the American hospital in Paris, carrying with him a red cashmere Hermes blanket, a gift from Maria. Even at the very end, surrounded by doctors and nurses, he held on to that small physical reminder of the woman he had genuinely loved. On March 15, 1975, at the age of 69, Aristotle Onassis died of respiratory failure in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside Paris. The man who had built the world's largest privately owned shipping fleet, married a former first lady, and amassed a fortune vast enough to make billionaire mean something at a time when few people held that title, died in a hospital bed, broken by grief and illness. He was buried on Scorpios, the island he had purchased during his years with Maria Callas, beside his son Alexander. Later, his sister Artemis would be buried there too. And in 1988, Christina would join them after dying of a heart attack in Buenos Aires at just 37 years old. After Aristotle's death, Christina settled with Jackie for $25 million in exchange for Jackie dropping any challenge to the will. Jackie continued receiving her agreed annual payments for the rest of her life. Christina inherited 55% of her father's fortune, then valued at around $500 million. The remaining 45% went toward establishing the Alexander Onassis Foundation, created in memory of the son who died far too young. Maria Callas never truly recovered from Aristotle's death. She had given up her career, her voice, and her health for a man who married someone else and yet never stopped loving her. On September 16, 1977, at 53 years old, she died alone in her Paris apartment of a heart attack. In 1979, her ashes were scattered off the coast of Scorpios, finally coming to rest near the man who had been both the greatest love of her life and its deepest source of pain. The legacy. Aristotle Onassis spent his life accumulating wealth and power on a scale almost nobody achieves. He built an empire from literally nothing, surviving disasters that would have finished off far weaker men. He married into shipping aristocracy, then married into American royalty. He owned an airline, controlled a casino empire, and commanded a fleet bigger than the navies of many countries. He moved through the world as though he owned it. But in the end, none of that mattered at all. All his money couldn't save his son from a 15-second flight that ended in disaster. All his power couldn't stop the slow decline of his own health. All his fame couldn't fill the void that Alexander's death carved into his life. His daughter Christina inherited the empire but not his resilience. She married 4 times, and each marriage ended in divorce. She battled weight problems, depression, and a persistent inability to find lasting happiness despite unimaginable wealth. When she died at 37, the empire passed to her daughter, Athina Onassis Roussel, who was only 3 years old at the time. The Christina yacht was eventually sold and turned into a floating museum. Olympic Airways was handed back to the Greek government and went through several transformations afterward. Scorpios remained in the family for decades before it was eventually sold off entirely. The properties, the businesses, the empire, all of it eventually scattered and dissolved. What's left behind is the story itself. The refugee who became a billionaire. The man who loved Maria Callas but married Jackie Kennedy. The tycoon who built an empire he couldn't use to protect his own son. The legend who learned, far too late, that wealth means nothing without the people you love standing beside you. In the handwritten will he drafted during that troubled Acapulco trip with Jackie, as their marriage was already crumbling, Aristotle left instructions for what would become the Alexander Onassis Foundation. That foundation remains active today, funding work in education, medicine, and the arts. It promotes Greek culture around the world, provides scholarships for Greek university students, and hands out awards recognizing achievement across multiple fields. It stands as a fitting legacy for a man who rose out of the ashes of Smyrna to build something extraordinary. But anyone who knew Aristotle Onassis in his final years would tell you the same thing: he would have handed it all back. Every dollar, every ship, every piece of property and possession, for just one more day with his son. Some empires are torn down by outside invaders. Others simply crumble under their own weight. Aristotle Onassis's empire outlived him, but the man himself was ultimately brought down by grief. He conquered the world of business and still lost the fight that actually mattered. And that, in the end, is the loneliest kind of downfall there is. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one.